Kia ora koutou. Hello, my name's Gillian Lee. I'm the Coordinator Web Archives here at the Alexander Turnbull Library, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's session. And we have 3 presentations. The theme is Email Archives and Social Memory, Collecting and Managing Individual and Personal Email. So each presentation will be about 20 minutes, and then once all the speakers have finished their presentations, we'll have time for questions at the very end. So let me introduce our first speakers. Dr. Maya Kurtalik and Dr. Jessie Dineen from the Victoria University of Wellington. Maya is a senior lecturer in information studies, and Jessie is a senior lecturer in information systems. They will be looking at the factors influencing the management of emails in personal, organisational and societal contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou. My name is Maya and this is Jaye, and we both teach and research at Victoria University School of Information Management. We are one office next to another, and we both research in the area of personal information management, which was a nice coincidence when we started working. And from that personal information management perspective, we will present the topic for today. So we will talk about emails, especially emails as legacy, and factors influencing the management of email in personal, organizational, and societal context. So the focus of our presentation will be slightly different than the presentations so far, which were super interesting. And we will talk about people behind emails. So what are the factors that make people treat emails the way they do, and how that affects entire process of organizing and preserving email and transferring to collections of collecting institutions.
Are the slides up?
Sorry. It's not changing.
There we go. So the arrow is working now. You just had to get closer.
Like I said, everything is about people. Today we will talk about some background research and information that is relevant to the ideas we will present in today's research. Then we will focus on factors influencing email management and try to give some recommendations for effective email management on personal and institutional level. And we'll talk about emails as legacy and what happens when people wish to transfer their email collections to libraries, archives, and museums.
So the first part of the background is a technical one. I'm glad that someone at the questions at the end of the last session was saying, let's get more fundamental for a moment. So the background's kind of split into 2 areas, technical and then more on the social side. So, and someone said, what is an email? Which is a good question. And I would even say just, what is email, generally? As a standard and a tool, email is a relatively simple thing that, like many tools, get appropriated for different uses by the many different users. So things that email was not designed to do, it ends up doing, which in other words, and as it's often referred to in literature, it's kind of an overloaded tool. So it is of course a standard for communication, for sending some message, but also because it's, in part because it's used for communication, it gets used for coordination and collaboration in different ways beyond just what's contained in the message, also for record keeping as we've discussed today, and for personal information management, which makes it a particularly interesting thing for us. And of course then it has integration with other formats beyond email, right? Which is sort of how attachments work, but there's more to it because there are systems like Outlook or Lotus Notes and what have you that try to integrate with email in some meaningful way. So it is a slightly abused tool. And also the scale of it is pretty large, right? So we were sort of conjecturing earlier, like, yeah, 300 emails is probably uncommon. How many are there? 3,000, 30,000, 300,000? Not sure. And I couldn't find any sort of recent figures about this in the literature. But the average collection size grew 10 times from 96 to 2006. And given how storage has grown, I think we can assume it's a lot more than 10 times more than that up to now, right? And if it's anything like files, which I've done some dedicated studies of, people tend to have tens of thousands of those. So if your emails are coming in a higher volume than your files, you probably have many tens of thousands of emails. And there are several issues with email management that have been established in the literature, but despite these sort of difficulties and this overloaded context, systems, the tool side of it is evolving rather slowly in comparison to the scale at which we're getting emails.
There are many perspectives which you can take when looking at email management and what we can do in that area. We are particularly interested in stakeholders and various roles of people working with email management and email archives. Contributors, donors, curators, archivists, researchers, consumers. And each of this group of people have their own specific views on what needs to be preserved and how it needs to be preserved and how it needs to be offered for access and reuse for future generations. So we can talk about management as the process, but also we can talk about emails as collections and email as an artifact. And both of them both process and the collection are affected by many factors at different levels. What we are focusing on today is the interaction between an individual, a group, and institution as a wider context in which email management occurs, and factors influencing communication and those interactions. So we'll use some background research and information we are aware of to kind of give our views of the process, focusing on these three factors.
Yeah, so the question is sort of like, what determines these collections before they become archives? What are the factors that shape them at individual, group, and institutional levels? So starting with individual factors, there are, in personal information management research, there's quite a lot of research looking at how people manage emails. And some of the broader takeaways are that actually most of, and this probably doesn't surprise anyone, most time interacting with emails is spent reading and writing them, and actually very little time relatively is spent organizing them, even if it feels like a lot. So that's telling already. Then, because of the overloaded context and the multiple various stakeholders involved, this sort of complicated problem space, different strategies have emerged to interacting with and organizing email. So there are all these different characterizations in the literature, like prioritizers, archivers, no-filers, spring cleaners, people who go in and occasionally try to clean up their email collections or inboxes, frequent filers, folder cleaners, and so on. And it looks like these strategies emerge as a sort of response to various underlying factors. So things that have been examined in the literature, I've just sort of grouped them roughly by affinity here. First, you have, maybe we could say sort of contextual factors, like what occupation or tasks, if it's more fine-grained than that, are determining the interactions with the emails or the impetus for them, or how they're responded to, how they need to be organized, and so on. So of course, people with two different jobs may handle email very differently. Then the types of email, so there's some distinctions between ephemeral information types, ephemeral information and working information and long-term information and so on. Then the rate at which, and the volume at which messages are coming and going, right? People who get quite a lot of emails in a day need to probably respond to that by having a different strategy to checking, reading, triaging, and so on than people who are getting relatively few. Then there are things really in the individual differences and differences in psychology. So first you have things like user preference. So, and this may be developed in part because of other systems you're using, like files and folders on the computer, rather than just in the email context. So you might have a preference for search rather than navigation, which would lead you to, create fewer folders and rely on the search box more, right? Or you may have a preference for navigation that might lead you to have a lot of folders. Then there are things like different cognitive abilities, different spatial ability. These are all aspects that have been examined and all have like a little, essentially, role to play in determining what shapes the collection and how the person responds to this challenge. Then things like a desire for order, which some people have very high and some people have very low, right? And a desire for inbox zero, which is sort of a subcategory of that. Some people get very anxious, like a colleague last night showed me their inbox. It said 12,000 unread emails. Made my skin crawl. I guess they're getting the same vibe here. Then things like risk aversion. If you're really averse to risk, you may not delete things because you think, I'm going to need it at some point, or it's going to be useful at some point, and it may not be, right? So you may end up hoarding. And there's been some interesting recent studies of digital hoarding. Then there are structural, sort of drier things like about the collection and its size and how it's already organized, and then how old it is and how much time has passed since the person's seen it, and their familiarity with it, because email is often very personal in the sense that they're like ours or about us, but sometimes you're responsible for emails that are not yours, or that you're given, you start a new role and they say this role has its own email address. The information you need about how to do it's already in there. Then you have to familiarize yourself with it, how it's organized or not, and so on. And then lastly, at the individual level, we're affected by the software that we're using and what you can and can't do with it, and also what the interface encourages or discourages you to do with it. And then quickly, a few group factors, things determining how individuals are working together with information generally, but email specifically. It's kind of an interesting context anytime we're working together to collaboratively manage information, because with email and with files and so on, because we either have to identify and use some hopefully explicit strategy for organizing knowledge, which is like a pretty well-examined problem in information studies research, for example, or create one on the fly, probably implicitly, and hope that everyone's sort of on the same page about it. So this problem is getting recreated frequently. And what's determining this is in the behavior and then the resulting collection is in part the individuals, all the things I just covered, but also their sort of social aspects, not just for themselves, to themselves, but also their sharing habits, for example, their collaboration habits. And then whatever the task is that is shared at the moment, again, the software and its integration, how it supports group work or doesn't, and then the implicit or explicit expectations about how they're going to do things and whether or not they've been made clear. And then the sort of underlying phenomenon behind all this is, you could say, mutual intelligibility. So we could say you could characterize this as the sort of tension. The more you personalize, whether it's some folder hierarchy or labels for emails or what have you, the more you personalize it so it's really meaningful to you, the less sense it makes to someone else. And the more, therefore, you generalize it for a group of people, the less individually meaningful it is. And this is just a kind of problem we have to try to overcome with convention and new tools, software, and so on.
And then we have institutional factors. I think very often institutions tend to ignore that people and groups of people have their own ways around managing emails and preserving them for the future. So I think when we consider institutional factors, we need to be aware that understanding and addressing why, what, how, and when to manage emails in an organization is a very important question, and one that can actually be addressed relatively easily. We can think of this process of addressing these questions following these four, so to say, points. We can think about content and value of emails, but when we try to define what is valuable and what is not for an institution, again, we need to be aware that different people have different values, and this is something that would need to be explicitly explained and preferably written in an organization's policy documents and strategy. We can also think about value in terms of current value, but also long-term value. But we need to factor in the purpose and the context in which emails have been created. We can focus on processes and potential for reuse in the future. But to be able to address all these why, what, how, and when in these four categories, there needs to be transparent communication between individuals who work for an organization, processes and policies that exist, and wider mission of an organization, and whether email production need to be preserved for the future, and how likely is it that email collections will end up in collections of libraries, archives, and museums. And following some of these points on personal, group, and individual factors, we can make several recommendations that may or may not be useful and work in every context, but in general, I think these are recommendations that we should be considering.
Yeah, and recommendations coming out of personal information management research are very tenuous because it is inherently a very personalized thing. So what works for one person, even just at one time, may not work for someone else or that same person at another time. But as a result, the sort of main sort of meta prescription that comes out of that is that it's valuable to seek out different strategies for doing personal information management, discuss them with people who have similar tasks or collections, and try different ones, which can just be valuable for giving you an opportunity to reflect on what you're doing. So just as a little example, I was talking to someone and they said, oh, if you're receiving a high volume of emails and it's making you feel anxious because there's too many in the inbox and you feel like you're losing control of it, try just triaging them in a sort of low priority order. So get rid of garbage first and then focus on whatever's left. This, I hope it sounds obvious, and I hope we've all been doing that, but to some people this is an entirely new way to handle it, right? So just hearing these strategies and thinking about them is valuable in and of itself. So another sort of quick and easy one, and I'll contradict myself in a moment in recommending against it as well. Cleanup, I would suggest not to do for now, because it's costly, right? To do this spring cleaning thing is a big investment of time and energy, and it gives a little immediate return, especially if storage is cheap so you can store all the emails you want, and search is pretty good. So some studies have found search is relatively effective for finding the majority of emails in certain contexts, so I will qualify in a moment. And then this is a kind of fun finding from research that people with these personalized committed strategies, so people who are just thinking about it and trying, have more, a word I was really not expecting to see, fun with, and are more satisfied with their email use and management. So that's promising, I think. And then to sort of paint some different contrasts for additional ways to think about strategizing email management, there's a sort of time-saving now, harder to reuse later strategy. So don't sort anything, just use the search like I just mentioned. This has acceptable success rates for known item searches in particular. So if you know what you're looking for and you're familiar with the collection, you know what language is being used in the documents you're searching for, then you can foresee a match. And if your search function is good, then you can get the email you need. These are not always the case, so that has to be taken with some salt. Then there's the time-intensive now but facilitates reuse later idea, right? So sort often and think about reuse for yourself and for others. And that's kind of a slightly pedantic distinction, because if you spend some time away from the collection or go on vacation for a few months, coming back to a collection, you might be unfamiliar with it, just like someone who's never seen it before would be, or close to it. So think about you and others in the future potentially using some collection, whether it's email or what have you. So you can do things now like sorting and tagging, and automation can help with that, like we'll mention in a moment. And this helps others make sense of collection later. And in the last session, we didn't talk much about access and reuse except for one of the questions from the audience. So I'm curious to talk at some point about the role of things like folders and labels and so on in email archives, because that's the kind of argument I'm making here, is that these can help us with access, right? So then at the group level, well, it might not be a surprise, explicate conventions when you're working with a group for how you're going to handle folders and tags, version control, duplication, retention, and so on. There are very often people are worried about stepping on each other's toes or deleting something important, but they need to make a modification, so they'll make a copy. And then you have a version control issue and lots of redundancy and so on. And I wasn't surprised to see there's 40-something% redundancy in emails, because that's about what I found with files on people's computers as well. So, but if you're going to come up with some convention, I would suggest to use lightweight rules. Studies have shown if an organization says, here's the new content management system, only ever interact and send files through this for security reasons. If it's difficult to use, people just won't do it and they'll attach the files to emails. So think of that like on a less formal level. Rules need to be kind of lightweight. And there are some good reasons beyond just immediate access and ease of use to think about this sort of longitudinal aspect, right? For knowledge continuity across positions and in an institution, and to avoid info and value loss, but I think we're all on the same page about that, so I'll spare you. Sorry.
That's right. So how to factor all these recommendations in when it comes to institutional level? It's logical to say have clear, accessible, and up-to-date policies. But in practice, it is sometimes really, really hard, especially when you are a new member, staff member of an organization, to actually find out what those policies for email management and in general the records management are. So from an institutional point of view, consider format and content of email management policies. And very useful way or approach to do that is to consider so what and what if scenarios to raise awareness and address critical issues. Because that kind of a storytelling potential in building these scenarios helps people to understand and to make it really lively, visible what to expect and what can go wrong and how to or not even what can go wrong, what can be good if you manage your emails in a certain way. The second recommendation is to have procedures to help with common issues. So naming, adding metadata, respecting format requirements, and so on. But again, factoring in the personal and people's kind of a way to go around some of the set policies. So again, lightweight rules is something that helps. Further on, many different organizations use different softwares, but being aware what the software can do to reconcile authority records, make finding aids, remove confidential information, and so on. So knowing what is out there and how we can apply it is very valuable here. But again, every institution must decide and see how a specific software works in their specific context. And then there's something that we don't often hear about, and that's sustainability issues. And when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about environmental sustainability, cultural and societal perspectives in sustainability. But also, we should take into account disruptive events. And disruptive events can range from staff changes to disaster management. And just let me spend a minute on the effect of staff changes, for example. We recently faced the situation where a few of our staff members retired after 20 years. And we had a situation where we very panically asked them, okay, give us all your emails and ideally capture all the decision making and knowledge that goes with those emails, because just having emails won't help us when we need to go back and look how a certain situation was addressed 5 or 10 years ago, because situations tend to repeat themselves. So thinking about new staff coming into an organization and their personal information management practices, but also thinking about how to hand over knowledge and collection of emails from one person to another. And even simple things like having an email address that goes with the role and not with the person, so you don't lose access to some valuable data. We are kind of out of time, so just I would like to finish with a project we are currently working on, and the project looks at personal collections of significant individuals in New Zealand. And by significant individuals, we mean people who contributed and have done something valuable for the society in their life, from creative sectors, writers, artists, and so on, to public sector. And emails are part of their personal collection. So in our research so far, we looked at evidence and context that such information from emails gives and how it can be used, but we also looked at diverse management strategies people use, and we looked at issues in transition from personal collections to collective collections. Most of our participants are in their 70s and 80s, so it is very interesting to look at the way they address emails. And very often they tend to print out important emails, whether as physical paper items or printed to PDF format and store it with the rest of their collection. So this is for, one example in a personal collection where email becomes extracted from the rest of the collection, and by that act of extraction, a value is assigned. So looking at what can happen outside the email collection is also interesting. We'll post more information about this project as it comes, but keep an eye on the project. I think it will have some relatively relevant information for collective collection institutions. We don't have, unfortunately, much time, but maybe, Jaye, you can just finish with software?
Yes, what to say about it in a very brief nutshell. This is a kind of older prototype, so a newer version of it looks a bit nicer, but we're working on software to help individuals annotate collections, especially digital collections. So this is an example just showing files and folders, and using features like sorting by where the majority of access is provided, because there is an uneven distribution of files into folders, probably of emails into folders, and so on. So just trying to make use of a few sort of things that we know about such collections to allow individuals to annotate them quickly to facilitate future reuse in the context of this Hidden Heritage Project and elsewhere, but yeah, I'll save the rest for later. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya and Jaye. That was really interesting. It makes me wonder how I use my emails now. I have to go and think about that. So our second speaker is Lachlan Glanville, and he is a digital archivist at the University of Melbourne Archives, and he's going to be sharing about the work he and others have undertaken to preserve emails, in particular the Germaine Greer email collections. So thank you very much.
No? Thanks. Okay, enter. All right, cool. Hello, everyone. So my name's Lachlan Glanville. I'm the digital archivist at University of Melbourne Archives. For those of you who don't know us, we're the permanent home for the university's permanent business records, but we're also a collecting archive. We have collecting strengths in trade unionism, business records, but we've also got quite a strong second wave feminism contingent, which is sort of where the Germaine Greer archive comes in. Now, I started working at University of Melbourne in 2014. I came on as a project archivist to help process the Greer archive, but specifically the paper. My first task was the general correspondence series. So this was paper correspondence. So the next year was spent, amongst other things, gradually sifting through 120 boxes of letters, faxes, and emails, primarily to describe them in detail, but also to safeguard the privacy of the people who had shared often highly personal information, anecdotes, and stories with Greer. Now, the nature of Greer's work means that, like, a lot of her correspondence treated her as a confidant and shared anecdotes on sort of the difficult subjects that she's written about over the last 50 years. So in these boxes, there are a lot of printed emails. They're often hand annotated by Greer with instructions for an appropriate response. It's quite a nice example. They're not always so polite. Pop trivia that Greer was arrested in New Zealand in 1971 for public obscenity. So interestingly, because the files are not arranged chronologically, printed emails often end up alongside telegrams, alongside carbon copy typescripts. So because Greer is a high-profile living donor who writes on controversial and sensitive topics, we went through the paper collection with a fine-tooth comb to protect the privacy of both Greer and the thousands of people who've written to her since the 70s. Now, alongside the paper archive is a very large component of born digital material. So the University of Melbourne Archives has been collecting paper archives for 60 years. And like we've known for quite a long time that we needed to make a transition to born digital collecting. Prior to the Greer acquisition, we really had no existing procedures. We had no skills. Where we'd attempted in the past to train up existing staff in sort of the use of digital archiving techniques, they were generally on project footings and left after a period of time. And we definitely had no infrastructure for digital preservation, so we couldn't even ensure that, like, once we brought collections in, that they were, you know, what is perpetuity, but preserved for perpetuity. Enter the Digital Preservation Project. So early on, the archive found an ally in University of Melbourne's Digital Preservation Project, which commenced in March 2016. So this project was set up to drive digital preservation culture at the university, to get the university to invest in infrastructure, to build digital preservation into the university's policies, to identify key areas requiring preservation infrastructure, and ultimately make it a core part of the university's activities. So as a part of this, cultural collections and the archive were identified as a key domain for the project. We have worked closely since then in developing appropriate policies and procedures to safeguard our digital collections, while hopefully building up tools and expertise that can serve other areas of the university who might be undergoing similar activities. There's a whole raft of different special collections across the university, potentially with similar issues. So if we can share some of this documentation, then all the better. And then in turn, like the presence of a high-profile research collection in Greer that had this key need for infrastructure, for skills, for guidelines, it's aided the digital preservation program in demonstrating the value to the university. While a lot of digital assets have like an indeterminate or intangible value, with Greer we had a concrete dollar figure because it was a purchased collection. So that gave us a little bit of leverage in sort of demonstrating that, this genuinely does have value. This is something we really need to invest in. The good news for us is that the University of Melbourne is about to implement a university-wide digital preservation system, with the initial ingest tranches coming from the 4 key domains identified here, being research outputs, research data, university records and cultural collections. And elements of the Greer archive will be among the first material ingested there. So at least in the very near future, we can be a little bit more confident that that Greer's email has been preserved, and we can more readily collect email and other born digital materials from prospective donors. But we still have this issue of we've got this big lump of born digital materials. Preservation is one part of that aspect, and that the digital preservation system will help with that. But we've also got description, appraisal, sensitivity review. We've still got a limited understanding of what the actual content of the born digital materials are. And the complexity and the ergonomics of processing born digital materials, while physical processing is usually time-consuming, it's relatively easy to scan a page of text with your eyes, get a sense for the general content and the age of the material, whether it's likely to contain material or information that could be sensitive, or whether there's damage to the material. And it's much more difficult to do this in a digital context. Tim Gollins from National Records Scotland referred to this as a problem of ergonomics. So we can programmatically scan for potentially sensitive data using tools like Forensic Toolkit or Bulk Extractor, but these don't allow for instances where sensitivity is a matter of context, which is something we're really aware of in the paper archive. So this is another example of email. So this is a printed email from a well-known Australian painter, Ben Quilty, to Germaine Greer. I'm going to use this as an example for a couple of reasons, but also mainly because, one, we have it both in paper here, and we have a digital version as well. But also this is the sort of material that we would consider has high research value for researchers who are interested in either subject. So at this juncture where we've got a serious appraisal problem, not to mention description and access down the line, EPAD seems like a really elegant solution to us. The recent final report of the Born Digital Archives Working Group Email Archiving Task Force, which came out of Yale, identified EPAD as the only tool used in that they tested in the appraisal process. There are other tools out there like Darkmail, and the Raton project by the Big Curator Consortium is introducing some diversity, but it's much earlier in development and has a very different approach. And I want to say from the outset that what I'm about to say isn't a criticism of EPAD at all. It's an amazing project that's filling a very distinct gap for collecting archives. But what I hope to do is to underscore that the fragility of email, and that whenever we move to using new tools and explore transformation of born digital materials, it's absolutely critical that we are validating what we've received against the source. So our first major hurdle was that we had a huge proliferation of email formats in the GRIB material. The bulk were MIME email or EML. Some are in a similar format that we haven't quite identified because plain text or near plain text files are really difficult to identify programmatically. Still more were found on the hard drive of Greer's office computer, which was transferred with the collection. So as part of planning for the implementation of the digital preservation, we've been working towards a preferred formats register, partly to identify target formats and also to manage expectations when the systems is presented with obsolete or heavily proprietary formats. For email as a content category, we identified Mbox as a preferred format due to its open structure and the fact that it captures email in context via that sort of inbox level of aggregation. But also critically, EPAD requires it in order to do its thing. So the issue we had with the office computer emails is that they were enmeshed in the now defunct Microsoft Entourage, which was a Macintosh flavor of Outlook that Microsoft put out. I think it was active in sort of the late 2000s. So attempts to extract these email via digital forensics were pretty fruitless, as Entourage stores email as like a monolithic archive. It's this big file which is notoriously fragile and prone to corruption, which like a lot of forum posts from the time have a lot of frustration of people whose entire email archive has become corrupted. So the only way we could see to convert the email into an open format was via Entourage itself with an export. So we considered reconnecting the hard drive to the desktop, but in the end we were able to boot the disk image we created via QEMU. And that's Entourage running in an emulated environment there with the same email. So QEMU is one of the core components of the emulation as a service project that was referenced by Peter earlier in the day. From here, within the emulated environment, we were able to export the extracted emails, via like a drag and drop method into Mbox format, and then extract those exported files via a forensic toolkit to our desktop. It's a very roundabout way of doing it, but we couldn't see any other way. So great. We can just load these Mbox files into EPAD, right? So when we had attempted to import these extracted files into EPAD, it read each Mbox file as a single message. Now, the problem we found with Mbox as a format is that it's really more a family of formats that have been implemented in a range of ways by a range of different email clients and services. If you look at the pronom entry for Mbox, the description notes that National Archives hasn't been able to define a signature for the format due to the variety of structures and implementations. Wikipedia lists it as a family of formats. So we did some investigation, and in the end we found the problem that EPAD wasn't recognizing line breaks in the Mbox files, so we had to manually change the carriage returns in the Mbox files to carriage return line feed. And after that, they appeared to ingest fine. So our experience with email is fabulous as an appraisal tool. It solved a whole range of problems that were presented by email collections. The named entity recognition picks up not only the correspondence of individuals, but also about them, it gives us a top-down view of like the topics and places of interest as well. Don't know if you can see that, but yeah, Margaret Thatcher is just edged out by Jane Austen. Frank Zappa's down the bottom. The way it presents email has also allowed us to determine that there's a significant amount of digital material in these inboxes that isn't present in the paper, which is incredibly useful for us because it allows us to actually justify the amount of time we're spending on the digital material when at first glance it appeared that Greer was like a really consummate record keeper and had printed out just about everything. We found that's not actually true. The email that I showed you before, there's actually a much longer trail of conversation in digital form than there is in paper. But closer inspection showed up some problems. So when we compared the imported email against its paper copy, we can see that the timestamp has been processed incorrectly. We're missing an hour somewhere there. This isn't true of all emails, which makes it doubly difficult to actually check where we've got issues. You'll also notice that line breaks haven't been preserved in the imported email down below. And you'll also notice that the formatting of the ad banner down below has changed as well. Now, I don't know that we can call ad banners like a significant characteristic of email, but God knows if in 50 years we want to know about photos of singles in your area. But certainly signatures would be as well. Now, when we actually went in and compared the original inbox files with those that EPAD exports as like a preservation master, we found that the original files actually had both the plain text and an HTML rendition of this text. And the HTML and the markup hadn't been retained. It had just retained the plain text. So we've also come up with similar issues, but like slightly more troubling, with like another pilot project where whole bodies of emails have been missing. So, which leaves us with like a bit of a question: how do we ensure that what we are providing to researchers is actually evidentiary? Like, if we're going to continue to use EPAD, and we would really like to, because of its appraisal abilities, because of the amount of search capability within it, we need to be able to trust that what we are providing is actually evidentiary. And we need to do a significant amount of work identifying what we consider email's significant characteristics so we can validate against that. This actually comes from the Archive Mātauranga wiki, so potentially written by Justin Simpson. But this is 10 years old, so we probably need to relook at this and then work out how do we validate that all of these elements, at least in a portion of like the ingested materials, whether they have carried over correctly. Then finally, we need to develop preconditioning procedures to avoid the sort of passing errors we have here as we are ingesting email inboxes into EPAD. And this is a real lesson for with our digital preservation system on the horizon, because all of the same lessons still apply. We're going to need to do all of this work as we are ingesting this material into the digital preservation system to, ensure that what it is actually ingesting and holding as like an archival information package is actually true to the source. The other interesting question is, particularly in terms of access, is that kind of accidentally, we've got the option of providing access to Greer's email via her emulated desktop that I showed you earlier. So if authenticity is our primary concern, if we want to provide an experience to the researcher which is as close as possible to what Greer experienced herself as she was working through that material, and there's interesting intersections with the previous presentation in terms of preserving methods of working, that's as close as we can possibly get. But again, appraisal is the problem there. And not just of the inbox, but we'd be talking about appraising and then redacting an entire environment. It has been done, notably with Salman Rushdie's archive at Emory, but it's an enormously labour-intensive and niche way of approaching the problem of researcher access to email. The other question we have here is whether the authenticity of the interface makes up for the loss of search capabilities that you find in something like EPAD. Some early scoping of the literature we've done around born digital access has indicated that an emulated interface is viewed highly favourably by users for all the reasons we've mentioned above. But we need to actually go to our user base and find what they actually require in terms of access to born digital materials. So more questions than answers. But lessons learned, essentially, is build relationships where you can. Both the archive and the digital preservation project would be in a very different place now if we hadn't partnered when we did. We've made incredible headway in the last 3 years. Trust nothing, validate everything, stolen from the Digital Preservation Coalition. And best practice is always contextual, which was stolen from my boss, who stole it from our New Zealand host, who I think stole it from somewhere else. We can't assume that that one form of access to born digital materials is necessarily going to support researcher requirements with different user bases. And so we need to go and do that work and identify what those requirements actually are before we move on with another solution. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lachlan. So many complex issues, eh? Our third speakers are my colleagues, Valerie Love and Flora Feltham. Val is a senior digital archivist here at the Alexander Turnbull Library, and Flora is a digital archivist, and they will be talking about the work they and other colleagues have undertaken to collect, preserve, and make accessible emails in the Turnbull collections. Over to you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Not quite as intuitive as I was expecting it to be. All right, tēnā koutou katoa. As Jillian said, my name is Valerie Love, and today my colleague Flora Feltham and I will be talking about the history, preservation, and future of email in the Alexander Turnbull Library. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge that collecting and managing digital materials such as email is absolutely a collaborative team effort. So lots of people have been involved in the processing and the workflow and the decisions that have been made. And this talk in particular incorporates work from one of our manuscripts curators, Sean McMahon, who unfortunately is overseas at the moment, as well as our trustee digital collections services team leader, Jessica Moran. I just definitely wanted to acknowledge their contributions right up front. So I'm going to begin talking today by talking about some examples of email collecting and appraisal in our collections. And then Flora is going to offer a little bit of a more in-depth case study of processing one of our more recent email collections. So our manuscripts curators like to tell people that this is the oldest email held in Turnbull Library. So this is not really the oldest email in the library, but it is the Turnbull Library's oldest document and can be considered an example of correspondence. So this is a Sumerian clay tablet. I bet nobody was expecting that. Dated from about 2250 BCE, and the cuneiform inscription relates to fields of grain and the temple of the goddess Shara. So this type of object is often housed in a museum, but there is significant historical and cultural value to such an early example of human communication. And the intellectual content of the inscription clearly has informational value and evidentiary value as a record. And it also provides a resource for social history. So considering that the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand is relatively recent, it's quite extraordinary to have this item in our collections as a curatorial touchstone to more contemporary collections, to connect our more contemporary collections to the ancient world. So from here, we'll fast forward just a few thousand years. So this letter from George Bollinger was written from France in April of 1917, and it's typical of many items of wartime correspondence in the Turnbull's collections. Bollinger was writing to a Mrs. Rainbow in New Zealand during a break from serving on the front line. And from the image, you can see that the letter is not even the original letter. It's a holograph or a photocopy of the original letter. And at the top of the letter, there is, I'm not sure if I have a pointer, but at the top there's a typescript annotation noting the subsequent death of Bollinger 2 months after he wrote the letter. So there's no indication of when these photocopies were made or who added that extra typed text, but it does indicate that there are multiple creators of this document. And so this adds a level of mystery and complexity to the correspondence, not unlike electronic documents or wikis that are created by a community of users, often annotating, editing, reproducing, and updating items. So here we have some junk mail sent en masse rather than to a particular individual. And this item from our ephemera collection is from the JC Tūāpapa competition organized by the Wellington Junior Chamber of Commerce in the 1950s. So Tūāpapa would arrive in your letterbox, and competitors would cut out and collect particular coupons and then swap them with their friends. If you collected the most coupons for one particular product, you would win a cash prize. So I mentioned these first few examples of correspondence from the Turnbull collections because in many ways email isn't so different from them. Printed junk mail like this could be considered a precursor to the spam emails of today, which have been mentioned in a few presentations. And while most people don't give junk mail and spam a whole lot of thought at the time that they receive them, aside from maybe just minor annoyance, the Tūāpapa offers of the past and contemporary spam messages may well provide future researchers with some insights into particular cultural moments in time. So on to actual email. The Turnbull Library began to collect examples of emails in the late 1990s. And as we've heard also today, the first option for collecting email was the print-to-paper option, where senders or recipients had printed the emails. And personal collections, particularly from literary figures, often comprise correspondence with occasional email messages printed onto paper like this one. So this is an email that was sent to the poet Meg Campbell from her friend Sue in the year 2000, and it includes that lovely line of, "Even your emails are magic, we'll write again soon." But of course, because we just have this side of the correspondence, we don't actually know what that magic email was. But we can see at the bottom that it says that it was printed for Meg Campbell from her email account. So there's still quite a bit of contextual information in this printout. Another example of printed email are email newsletters from the network Waitangi Wellington, accessioned in 2005. And this print-to-paper option is still used as a form of record keeping, particularly where the content of the email is more important than the medium itself. And we have over 70 manuscript collections, and probably a few more than that too, which include printouts of emails. However, it is an analog solution to a digital problem, and the information is there, but it's not quite the same. It's like that photocopy of the letter. It isn't quite the same. But more importantly, the printed version of the email doesn't allow the researcher to engage with the email as it was originally intended, as a born digital object. So it doesn't have any of the core functionality of that digital content, such as search capability, hyperlinks, or other dynamic content. The next iteration we've seen is creators exporting single emails out of their email mailboxes and into text-based electronic documents, such as Microsoft Word or PDF. And this example is from the collection of Michael Fathers, who was a Kiwi journalist and writer based in London. So these emails sent between 1999 and 2002 were received as exported text files, and they arrived at the library on 3.5-inch floppy disks. However, the text files only displayed the body content of the email messages and didn't contain any header information with the sender and date or any other metadata. So as you can see, that does leave out quite a bit of contextual information as well as the spirit of the email itself. Among the earliest collections that the library received electronically as email archives rather than as printouts or exported files were the records of several members of the New Zealand Green Party between the years 2009 and 2011. So Sue Bradford, Sue Kedgley, and Keith Locke, all donated their Outlook data PST files to the library, among other physical and born digital records generated during their time in Parliament. Interestingly enough, Sue Bradford also supplied a copy of her Twitter archive, her Twitter account exported into a spreadsheet of tweets, and so that was actually one of the library's earliest social media acquisitions. The PST files are stored in the National Digital Heritage Archive, or NDHA, which uses Rosetta Digital Preservation Software, as Jan has said, and are linked to the finding aid for the collection, as you can see here on the slide. However, in order to function properly, the PST files need to be opened from within Outlook, which for security reasons is not actually available on our reading room computers. So we are currently working on ways to make these and other email archives a little bit more user-friendly for researchers. Also in 2011, the Turnbull Library received a large collection of research materials from Dame Judith Binney, a renowned historian in New Zealand. The first lot of Binney's papers were donated to the library by her partner and included over 20 linear meters of physical materials, as well as Binney's Dell Latitude D820 laptop. And the laptop contained 145 folders with over 3,000 files and over 18,000 emails. Following the transfer of the digital content from the laptop was returned to the donor. And a number of staff across teams were involved in the acquisition and processing of this collection. So Judith Binney's email comprised 20 Outlook Express files, Outlook Express backup files, or DBX files, from her personal email address, which was jbinney@clear.net.nz, dating from 2001 to 2011. And at the time that we received it, we didn't have a good way of analyzing the 10 years of email messages in those backup files. So a few years later, in 2015, when the library began using ePad software, that allowed us a window into begin to better understand the content of Binney's emails. So out of the 20 email folders and 18,301 messages, we decided not to keep 5 mailboxes that were mainly system folders, and we also decided not to keep the deleted items folder in order to honor Binney's own appraisal decision of marking those items as for deletion. However, we did retain the spam mailbox, as it contained a message that presumably had either been moved or filtered there by mistake, as well as the spam messages. In addition to the DBX files, there were also 9 individual EML files containing photographic attachments. The EML files display in the NDHA viewer as text files, but unlike the exported text files from the Michael Fathers collection, they still display the header and encoding information. Unfortunately, the attachments in the files do not display in the viewer, but can be viewed as exported objects. So as indicated earlier, electronic mail falls within our collecting mandate for research and historical reasons as a record of communication. Preserving examples of email created in various applications like Outlook, Eudora, or within a Macintosh operating system, or via Gmail, also provides snapshots of the development of email software and use over time. One of the things that makes working with email challenging is that the examples from the collections I've shown so far don't really capture the full functionality and purpose of email. The researcher still needs to make a lot of effort to connect the dots, so to speak. And we've already seen massive changes in how people communicate and use email over time. When electronic records arrive at the library, they are usually part of a larger collection of files and analog papers. To fully comprehend how the creators worked, it is important to see what electronic files have been saved to their computer and how these files may have interacted with their emails as well. So the analysis of email fits in with an overriding appraisal of a hybrid collection as a whole and all of the formats within it. So Sean McMahon, the assistant curator for manuscripts at Turnbull Library, has spent a lot of time thinking about how to apply traditional methods of archival appraisal to email in particular, and has come up with this schema of considerations for email collections. The schema begins with the principle of provenance and moves forward all the way through to end use and reuse. Within each category, there are a myriad of possible questions to consider for each incoming email collection in terms of how we process and make it available. And unfortunately, there are no easy answers. But from here, I will hand over to Flora, who's going to give a more detailed case study of the library's use of ePad for processing email and talk about what's next at Turnbull Library.
Kia ora koutou. So Val has talked about some of the library's history of email collecting, and I guess I'm the ghost of email collecting present and future. And I'm going to talk to you specifically about our recent experience working with Peter to make the Ian Weddy email archive, or well, the metadata about the Ian Weddy email archive accessible via Stanford University's publicly available ePad platform. I'm going to be doubling up on some material that you guys have heard today, but repetition is good for learning. So who is Ian Weddy? Ian Weddy is a New Zealand poet, fiction writer, critic and art curator, and he was the Poet Laureate here from 2011 to 2013. His collection came to the library in 2013, and it contains his analogue and born digital literary and personal papers. The email archive portion of this is a slice of his emails from between 2003 and 2005, spread across 3 PST mailbox files. There are about 2,100 individual messages, and it includes both sent and received emails. Last year, Peter contacted us about providing metadata for the publicly available instance of ePad's Discovery module that would be supported by Stanford, but it provides access to metadata about heritage email collections around the world. Our role in this was to generate the correct metadata in a local instance of ePad and then send the metadata to Stanford for upload to the public platform. It's worth noting that, given they're so contemporary, most of our email collections, including the Dame Judith Binney collection, are highly restricted, so couldn't be used for this project. And I think it was really exciting that Ian Weddy was keen for the metadata from his emails to be publicly available and his emails accessible in the National Library Reading Room. I think everybody here has probably read Christopher Prom's 2 editions of Preserving Email, and you're here because you're interested in the ways that email collections challenge traditional archival practice. So I'll try and tread lightly here, but I think the first thing to note is that ePad addresses many of the tricky points that Val noted earlier. So within ePad, you can navigate collections of emails as if you were with an inbox, which not only retains that all-important message context, but also reflects how we naturally want to engage with emails ourselves, as we do every day. Speaking to that access point, so I don't think we've actually had anyone come in to use the Ian Weddy emails yet. Jess is shaking her head, so that's a no. But our policy will be that if somebody does want to come in, we will put ePad on a laptop and they will be able to access the archive through ePad in the reading room. So obviously an email inbox contains thousands of emails, and if we want to be decent archivists, this makes appraisal hard. How do you appraise material, retain original order and context at an adequately granular level when thousands of messages are chunked together in one file? As Christopher Prom notes, in generic terms, email is just an application to send digital information between accounts, and a single email account contains records of disparate context, structure and content, documenting activities both mundane and extraordinary. And in the context of Ian Weddy, I'll add that material that might require very different access conditions. So in the case of the Weddy collection, we needed to redact all emails on one particular topic to meet the conditions of the donation. So Peter told us about the lexicon search earlier this morning. What we did is we created a lexicon, our own, of the relevant terms and used that to identify a set of 180 emails that met that criteria. It wasn't that was not the lexicon we used. But that was that worked really well. But we then assessed every one of those 180 emails manually and marked maybe 20 as not for transfer to the next module, so they would be effectively restricted from the archive. This manual assessment did take a long time, but appraisal work always takes a long time, and I think given the kind of needle in the haystack vibe, we did pretty well to confidently identify 20 emails to restrict. So the other thing that I was really fascinated by was how Wedi's email address book both bamboozled traditional archival processing, but also enabled an amazing granularity of access. And I think that's been quite an interesting theme today, the ways in which email is really challenging, but also can enable some really, really awesome stuff. So for example, email has a pretty fluffy notion of authority control, I think, at least for archivists who love that kind of stuff. Wedi himself used at least 6 email addresses and is referenced using all the above terms within the email archive. So I was really impressed that EPAD, when it generated the correspondence list, it managed to catch all of those and clump some of them together as the same person, Ian Wedi, but it didn't catch everything. So we had to spend time matching all of the Ian Wedi aliases in the correspondence list. He was also corresponding with over 1,300 people, many of whom themselves were using multiple email addresses, and we went through that list and disambiguated any email addresses that were erroneously matched together under the same name, and also identified matches that EPAD hadn't. When we downloaded the text file of his contact list for editing, it was 48 pages long, and cleaning this data took weeks and was the most significant chunk of time that we had to dedicate to any one task in this project, even with both myself and Val doing the checking. On the plus side though, 1,300 people is way too many to identify manually or list in a finding aid. So once we had done this work and the list was clean, EPAD was a much more powerful and granular search tool than we could have created on our own. So in access terms, those weeks of data cleanup really paid off. And then there's the distribution lists. What I found super interesting, and it's probably my favourite thing about this, is the impact of Wedi being on the New York Times distribution list and how that makes his address book look, or what conclusions you could draw from that. The New York Times is the most common correspondent after Wedi himself. So I guess this is really an argument for human parsing as well as computational, because unlike with traditional letters, the volume of emails doesn't necessarily tell you anything about someone's intimacy with the second highest entry in their address book. The fact that Wedi was on the New York Times distribution list also meant that George Bush was a frequently identified entity. But again, I don't think this was because Wedi himself was preoccupied with George Bush so much as well. He was president at the time and in the news a lot. And the cool thing about EPAD is that we could have suppressed those, both the New York Times and George Bush entries, if we decided that skewed the data too much, but we decided that wasn't an issue, and it's quite interesting. So if these were some of the technical challenges that EPAD allowed us to clean up, there were some that we didn't fix or couldn't fix, but that EPAD at least allowed us to see and flag to researchers. So dynamic content and outward links are a challenge for historic emails. This link to the 2004 Sydney Biennale newsletter now goes to the 2020 Sydney Biennale newsletter, which looks like it's going to be great. But this isn't something that we can necessarily fix unless we figure out a way to redirect everything to an archived website, but at least we can see that and flag it to researchers. I actually looked for an archived version of the 2004 Sydney Biennale website and I couldn't find one, so if anybody has one, can you send it to me? Also, EPAD helpfully identifies all of the inevitably vague, inconsistent or wrong timestamps. And what was interesting for me is that once we sent our clean and wonderful metadata to Peter, he couldn't upload it at his end. And eventually they found that the cause of the problem was a difference in the date format between the US and New Zealand Mac operating system. So to display the messages in their environment, they had to change the date format manually. But I'm happy to report this bug has been fixed. And it's really satisfying to know that our project helped progress the broader EPAD development. And as a final note about Ian Wedi, I wanted to say that something I also loved about working with this collection was that what we could tell about Ian's personal digital archiving habits. For example, like many of us, he regularly forwarded important emails from his work email address to his home email address. And this is a quote from Christopher Prom again. According to Kathy Marshall, people use 6 flawed strategies to implement the archiving instinct. And one of the more common strategies, people email documents to themselves to create an ad hoc archive in an attempt to communicate with a future version of oneself. And lastly, very quickly, so if that's the detailed view of one email collection, what is the larger and future view of email collecting at the National Library? Well, we currently have 45 PST files in the National Digital Heritage Archive and 285 individual email files. We don't have any inbox files in there, but we are currently working on several collections, so watch this space. I was been really interested in a lot of the talk today that people who even trying to identify email can be difficult because of what happens when you export an email as a different format. You'll notice that this pie chart doesn't include any .doc or .docx files, and that's because I couldn't figure out which ones were emails in the huge corpus of that content in the NDHA. So I'll be really interested to kind of like think about that a wee bit more. But I was interested to see some people exporting emails as like Mac writes things down there on the end. So while we have Peter at the National Library, we're going to focus on some older email collections that have been sitting on our workbench for a while. We are hoping that with Peter's support, we can progress these, as well as support further enhancements for EPAD. So thanks to the EPAD updates that came from our work on the Ian Weddy collection, we're able to start processing 3 more collections. So the collections of Chinese-Australian academic Henry Chan, the Greek-New Zealand composer John Psathis, and the Pakeha Taongapuro instrumentalist Richard Nuns. The Psathis collection is especially interesting because it contains emails in the Greek script, and that's not displaying properly, so we're going to package up those emails and send those to the EPAD people as well, which will further support bug fixes for the project. And the very last thing I'll say is that at the broadest level, when we're thinking about email at the ATL and National Library, we're thinking about it as just one contemporary method of online or internet-based communication as we expand into collecting social media and instant messaging. For example, the library is currently accepting donations of people's Facebook accounts, which often includes their messages. So I'm really excited about the work we're doing collecting email and also about the kind of the further work we're going to do collecting born digital communication. Thank you.
We have time for questions. We will be breaking at about 2:50 for afternoon tea. Is anybody who has questions?
That was very interesting to see the breadth of how emails and things are being used in an actual archival context like that, from what you were saying, for. But one of the interesting aspects, I guess, which you just touched on the end there, was email plus things like WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, all those things. They're sort of social media aspects. But then you've still got your WhatsApp, which is more, I guess, not quite social media, but still in the communication phase, and how that's being looked at as a future way of incorporating into the archives, and what your thoughts are on that trajectory.
I'll have a stab at that one. One of the things that has continually been a challenge in terms of collecting email, and I think other forms of communication like you've just mentioned, is that the creators of that don't necessarily see it as being historically valuable, so they don't necessarily want to give it to the library, or they think, oh, it's just me communicating with my partner about what we're going to have for dinner. That's not significant. But there is a lot of social value in that, particularly in terms of how people were talking, what language people were using, what foods they were eating. I mean, there's a lot of richness in that, but to us as we're living it, it seems so mundane. So I think that's one issue, just getting people to become more aware that actually there is research value in that for the future, and we are interested in collecting it. In terms of how exactly you go about doing that, that's 100% a work in progress. But I think just building that awareness, and we've started with some small steps again. So working on the Facebook project and saying that people have the option of donating their account, which includes their messages, or if they don't want to, they don't have to give us the messages. And also just doing some Twitter harvests. Our web archivists have been doing amazing work doing harvesting of Twitter, following hashtags during significant events. And also we've received downloaded Twitter accounts that people have downloaded. So yeah, it is something that we're currently working on, but no real easy solutions. It's a process.
This is a question for the Turnbull archivist and also for the Jermaine Greer archive. When you receive donations or acquisitions of people's physical papers, there's no copyright issues at play because there's a copy that moves from one person's possession to another. For these email collections, it inherently involves making copies, and it also seems to inherently involve a lot of material from where the copyright owner is not the owner of the original email archive. So anytime you have an email conversation between two people, the copyright of what you wrote sits with the person who wrote it and not necessarily with the person who's giving you the inbox of material. So how are you dealing with those issues?
Feel free to jump in if you'd like, Lachlan. I will say that there are copyright issues still with paper items as well, so it's not just digital objects that have copyright considerations. Because there are copyright considerations and complexity with multiple authors and multiple rights holders, that is one of the reasons why many of these email collections are restricted, where they require permission either from the donor or from, in some cases, the chief librarian, because the donor doesn't want to be bothered every time somebody wants to access materials. Let's see.
Yeah, I'd echo that. So those the physical correspondence that I catalogued in Greer, that is by and large material that wasn't created by Greer, that we don't have copyright for. We cannot digitize or publicize it in that sort of way, really, without pursuing individual correspondence, which is a road to madness. So email's similar. I think probably the bigger issue with email accounts is privacy and sensitivity, because it is a lot more fluid. There is a lot more capacity for digital materials to travel a lot further than, say even someone taking a snap of like a letter in a reading room.
Yeah, and one of the ways in which we mitigate that is by having the secure reading room where people access our Born Digital content. So there's some Born Digital content that is available online via the website and the finding aids, but most of it you do have to physically come in person to the reading room, and then that means abiding by the reading room policies and registering to access content and things like that. So there are systems in place that make it a little bit difficult for people to, misuse information that they access in the archive, but obviously no system is perfect.
Yeah, further to that, in the laptop that we provide access to Born Digital material on is completely locked down. You can't get anything off it. And also, Amy, your question is one that I don't know the detailed answer to, but it's kind of a curatorial question, because I know in like every deed of gift sets out those conditions of access and copyright and stuff. So that happens between the donor but yeah. So I don't actually know what the specific conditions of that one were. Jess might know, but it's that's a conversation that goes on.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the copyright is going to be there, and it resides with the author of the email. So which is part of